Obviously here we have the chop saw, so you know that this thing can go on any type of angle really. So every saw maxes out at an angle, like this one only goes to a 60. Some chop saws you see might only go to a 50 degrees. Some of them go higher than others, but every chop saw is generally going to get you up to a 45 degrees. So this thing has all types of knobs and stuff, most of them do. I have a knob right here that's going to lock this blade from coming up. I have a lever right here with a thumb button. That's gonna let me spin this saw around on an angle. And as you can see, I have a pointer there that's gonna let me set it on whatever angle precisely that I want. Something to note, the saw, you heard that, the saw locks into 0. The saw also locks into a 15, a 22.5, 31.6, and a 45. So if you know you want a 45, which you're gonna cut often, you're not gonna like try to look over here, you're just gonna let it set. Because wherever the saw locks in, that's where it wants to be. It also has a knob back here to where I can loosen this and I can set it on a bevel like this. Now you'll already notice this thing is jamming me up. I have 2 knobs, one on this side, and I have another same type of knob on this side that's gonna allow these to slide open. I can lock them back up. And now I can have that free range to set my saw all the way on a 45. Most of these saws, they'll let you go one way, right? But look, now I'm stuck. There's a yellow knob here that's I can pull forward rather, and it's gonna allow me to go the other way. So usually all these saws have some type of functionality like that. So I'll demonstrate a couple chop saw cuts for you guys, and I will go over, how to make a really neat and clean chop saw cut and be safe. So, as far as safety goes, I'm wearing glasses, but it would be up to you at this point to have your safety glasses on to be safe. So, anytime you use the chop saw, obviously, I'm gonna go up against the fence like that. So you wanna be firm against the fence. You don't wanna be rocking like this because that's gonna cause a dangerous situation. If your board is all messed up in here and you go to send a cut, it's not gonna be cutting square. It's not gonna be cutting relaxed. It's gonna wanna bind up on you. It might even wanna rip the piece out of your hands. This saw will take this piece of wood out of your hands and throw it across the yard, you know what I mean? So whenever you're using this saw, it's very important, A, make sure you don't have like strings dangling down, hair dangling down, whatever it might be. You don't want anything getting in this area at all. And I'm gonna keep a nice solid firm grip on this wood as I go to cut, making sure that I'm nice and tight against the fence, sitting nice and relaxed against that fence, because that's your goal, that's your guide, that's the saw's way of holding the wood square. You know what I mean? That's what this saw was designed to do. So I'll demonstrate a square cut. So something to note, a chop saw when it's set on 0, which is square, it cuts a 90-degree square cut. You don't need to pull out your speed square and draw a whole line for that. You can, let's say I needed a piece at 14.5 inches, right? I'll put one mark like this with the chop saw, and then center, I'm keeping my fingers away from this, away from the saw, obviously. So I just measured from here, right? So I know this is my piece. This is my finished piece. I'm gonna purposefully dip in on this side of the line so that I can accurately line the mark up with the chop saw. So what that looks like is this. So I've just dipped in. Now I know I need to come this way a little bit. Just like that. Generally, I try not to be moving it like this if I don't have to. If I can just make a cut straight down, that's gonna be your best bet. You know what I mean? You're not gonna you're not pulling the saw around or doing anything with the saw that you don't need to. So that's the chop saw. Another saw that you're going to use very commonly in trim with exterior trim is a jigsaw. So when this comes into play is all the time, right? You might have a notch. We'll call it a notch. So I'll draw one right here, just kind of a random one. So let's say I need to cut this notch out, right? This little L. So we all know that when we cut with a circular saw, in order to cut a notch, you have to overcut, right? So I'll show you what that looks like both ways real quick. I'll show you an overcut notch, and then I'll show you a notch that I make with the jigsaw, and you can see the difference. So I'm actually going to continue further with my cut to do what we call overcutting. Now, I'm left with just a little nub in there that I can easily just come over here, take my knife, notch it out. So that's what an overcut notch would look like. So as you can see, imagine that this was a nice piece of trim, right? This, obviously you can see these marks. You wouldn't want that on a finished trim piece. You know what I mean? It looks bad. So in order to make a notch where you don't have this overcut, you need something like this. So I'll draw the same notch, but cut it with the jigsaw, and you guys can see the difference there. So I can still start it with my skill saw. So I strategically stopped my cut before I went past. Now, you can take your jigsaw like this. And easily finish the cut, right? Without having ever overcut. See that? Now that keeps your notch really clean, and you don't have these marks on there that would in turn ruin the face of a piece of trim. So that's what the jigsaw most commonly comes into use for. Here I have a Sawzall. I'm sure you guys have seen this. This doesn't come into play unless you're making a rough cut. This thing doesn't cut accurately, really. It doesn't really cut straight. It does, but it's not going to be like, you're not going to cut trim with this. Let's say I needed to cut a nail somewhere. Let's say I need to take out a board. And I'll do that right now for you guys, just as an example. This block, let's say it was wrong, and I need to cut it out. I can cut right through that, and I just cut through nails, right? And now that's freed up. That's a scenario where you would use a Sawzall. This is called a power planer. Basically what it does is it will shave a little bit of thickness off of a piece of wood. So it has this dial here, and this is your gauge really for how much depth you're taking out. It goes from 3/32, at least this one, and then it goes all the way to 1/64. Generally, you only whip this thing out if something went wrong. So let's say you put on a bunch of floor joists, and one of the floor joists was high. You just need to shave down a little bit. That would be a scenario. But let me just show you guys how it works. I'll plane down the side of this thing just to show you. Now, one thing I should mention, these blades that go in here are super expensive. They last for a really long time. You do not want to run the power planer into a nail or a screw or any type of metal or anything like that, because it's going to destroy the blade. And then you're going to have to spend the money to replace the blade and take this thing apart. And it's just not, it's so easily avoidable to pull a screw or nail before you run it through. Like imagine if this was on the house, right? And somebody had put a nail into the top of this board. I'm not just going to run it over the nail. I'm going to pull that nail out first and just make completely sure that I'm not running this thing through anything but wood. Or, sometimes the AZEK trim is plastic, not wood, but you don't want to run it through any metal at all, and that's very important. And Again, when you use this, you just want to keep your hands like free and clear. So I'm gonna go in front first. So as you can see, it took an extremely small amount off. So I can set this deeper if I want by just turning the dial. I just took 1/16. Let's try full depth. Let's see what that takes. So as you can see, it took a lot more. Usually this thing doesn't take that much, even if it's set at full depth. This says 3/30 seconds, which is a little more than an eighth. So if you say you needed to take more than what this thing can take, you would have to do multiple passes. So if I wanted to take more, just hit it again. Okay. Now, the only time you would really use this during trim is if you're working on framing, the framing beneath the trim, because obviously trim is just on top of the framing. So if you needed to just shave a little off of the thickness of something or something like that, you can use this tool to do that. That's pretty much like all the cutting and fabricating tools that you'll need. I guess I also ought to go over sander, which this is probably one of the easiest and most basic ones. You'll use a sander generally a lot during wood trim, and I'll show you this too. We have all different types of sandpaper. It goes by, the way they gauge it is grit. So the higher the number of grit, the more smooth your sanding is gonna be. So if you had a lot of sanding to do, you would go with a rougher sandpaper. That's gonna take down more material for you and like sand down like more aggressively. A higher grit sandpaper is gonna give you like a smooth, like nice smooth finish, and it's not gonna take quite as much out of it. So say you have like some really deep saw mark that you had to sand, you would go for the rougher one first and then finish it with the higher grit. But basically when you're using this thing, you'll just wanna make sure that as you sand, you're holding your thing flat and not like this. Because if you sand, if you're like all tilted like that, it's gonna end up rounding over your edge and it's not gonna give it that, it's not gonna have that flat, sharp look like most trim would have. But either way, it's like that. And you'll always keep motion when you're sanding anything because you wanna sand it evenly. You don't wanna sit here like this and grind out a bunch of the wood right there, and now I'm gonna have a big dip right there, you know what I mean, that you can feel and see. You wanna sand evenly. So I'm keeping constant motion on it. I'm also just keeping it nice and flat and relaxed. I'm not pushing down wicked hard like that either. You don't wanna do that. You wanna let the weight of the sander just kind of ride along that, and it's gonna give you the cleanest result. I'm barely pushing down on this thing at all. I'm just letting the weight of the sander do the job and just keeping motion and keeping it flat. So sanding is gonna be one of your best friends when it comes to trim, and that will help you get out any imperfections. It'll help you get rid of saw marks, and it's just part of the whole process of, you know, trim in general. All right, that covers fabrication and cutting. So a couple things I want to show you. These are like Carpenter's best friend right here. It's a frame and square. It has rulers on the sides, and these have, you know, these rulers come into play with some more advanced stuff. But as far as like checking if something's square, you can like hold the square on the edge like this to see if something's square, or you can draw nice long lines with it. You can use it like this to project a line outwards. There's tons of different times when you need and use this, so definitely have one, definitely have access to one. Kind of in the same category as a 12-inch speed square. So it's just like your regular speed square in terms of what it can do, it's just bigger. So you have the same type of protractor with the pivot point, and the only difference there is it's just longer. The longer the square, the more accurate that it will be. So, of course, when it comes to drawing longer lines, you have this T-square. This thing is generally used for plywood. You can hook it on a full sheet of plywood, right? Like that, and draw a line all the way across it. So you know if you need a line that's 4 feet long, you can have this guy. And yeah, generally you only use this for plywood, but there are other times where you might grab it if you just need a long line for some reason or whatever, and you have a nice spot that you can hook it. Because in order to use this, you have to have it hooked somewhere nice. So like a factory edge of a plywood is always nice and square. So that's where we generally use these things. Another thing that's important, so I missed one cutting tool. This is a router. So this thing has a bit that spins in it. The bit that we have set up on it is meant for cutting flush. So I can actually demonstrate that for you guys real quick. There's all different types of bits that you can put on this thing to perform different types of tasks. You spin them to adjust the depth. So as you can see, it's raising this table up and down, and that's how you're going to adjust how deep you might want to make a cut. So, and when I get where I like it, I'm going to tighten this thing back down. Just a couple things to look out for. You don't want to plug it in while the router is on by accident, because then it could take off. It'll run across the floor. It'll maybe cut somebody, or, you know, God forbid. So this thing also has an adjustment, a switch here for rotations, RPMs, rotations per minute. So obviously, the higher the number, the more power, the faster it's going to be spinning. So you can do this and hear it kind of chill down a little bit. So it has actual RPM adjustments on it. This router setup is set up to cut flush. So what that'll do, I can just ride this. As you can see, it cut it perfectly flush. Just be careful, like when you go to use a router, as you can see, when I turn it off, it's still spinning. So I'm not just gonna go put it down and cause a dangerous situation. And yeah, don't plug it in while it's on. Just another big thing to look out for with the routers. I'll be going over these tools and you'll be seeing me use them, and you guys will get a chance to use them yourself. But I wanted to just go over like the arsenal with you guys so that you guys kind of get an idea of, you know, what it takes and what you need to have access to be able to do your job efficiently.